Did Portland police fail to de-escalate a situation between a homeless man and the police during what became a violent encounter when the homeless man lost his life? A Multnomah grand jury already found there was no fault in the shooting. But now we've got a criminal case that's being launched that is against the officers for basically doing their job. Let's take a look-see, because we all know that there are times when you are dealing with somebody who doesn't have full capacity of what's going on around them and doesn't have the ability to cognitively understand what's going on. If you have a situation where that person has some kind of knife, gun, whatever, oftentimes it ends in just horrible tragedy. We had one in Seattle not long ago down at the waterfront. Guy had a knife and he was homeless, and he was absolutely wigged out. Went after a cop and he was shot on the spot. And that's kind of what happened here. We're going to talk about it. And, is there wrongdoing? You don't want to see anybody killed, but then also the police have a job to do, which is provide, safety to the public. And in this case, the guy had two knives in his hands, and he was in a position mentally where he probably didn't know what he was doing, is what his dad said. Horrible scenario. So, what's the right and the wrong, or is there one here? And these people should not be living in homeless encampments. That's kind of my bottom line. They need to be getting help somewhere and letting them live, their lives. This is how some of them are ending. And that's not what you want for anybody. I mean, and specifically people with mental issues where they're probably not even aware of what's going on. If you've ever talked to somebody in extreme crisis, there's no talking them down. There's no de-escalating the situation. You know what I mean? It's kind of like, this is how it is. So, all right, before we jump on in, if you're new here, welcome. My name is Sean Reynolds. I own a couple of real estate companies, and I read the news for reasonable people. So let's jump on in. Portland police failed to de-escalate encounter with homeless man in mental distress. Wrongful death suit says. Okay. Oftentimes you'll hear about a civil suit happening after somebody wasn't convicted for something that they were brought up on criminal charges. Like in the OJ case, he had, multi-million-dollar judgment against him by the family of Nicole Simpson and Ron Brown, I think it was the friend of, I almost said Jessica Simpson. That's just not right. But you'll find, you'll have a civil case that'll award people millions, whereas the first one didn't have it didn't have a guilty judgment in the end, a guilty ruling. But civil and criminal are two different types of cases, and that's what we're looking at here. We're looking at the latter. So a wrongful death suit alleges police failed to de-escalate their encounter with Koben Henriksen in southeast Portland in 2019, and they used excessive force when they fatally shot the 51-year-old man who was homeless and in mental distress. Okay, right there, to me, it's like, this is one of those cases where, the guy's having mental problems. Do you send out the social worker? All right, the guy's got a couple of knives on him, right? So even if you did have a social worker out there, could they get to this guy in time where, public safety wasn't breached? I don't know. It doesn't sound like it. The lawsuit is filed against the city of Portland and the officer who shot Henriksen and seeks unspecified economic and non-economic damages. It was filed Wednesday in federal court in Portland. A Multnomah County grand jury found no criminal wrongdoing in the shooting. Henriksen was seen waving knives, plural, at passing cars near Mall 205 on December 8th, 2019. That is not something that you want to see, right? Grand jury determined Raphael acted in self-defense, the police officer, or in defense of others when he shot Henriksen with a rifle. Henriksen was shot 3 times, twice in the torso and once in the head. But the suit contends Raphael should have attempted to calm the situation, as the officer had encountered Henriksen 24 days earlier in almost identical circumstances. So how did that play into it? I don't know, but in so many of these cases, you are being forced to make a judgment call. The police officer is being forced to make a judgment call on something happening in real time, super quick. And they got to make a judgment call. And so if this guy had it in his head, all right, we saw this guy 24 days ago, I know who he is. We de-escalated it then. Let's give it a shot this time. But if the guy rushes you, I mean, what are you going to do? Are you just going to take it? No, you're not. That's okay. Just come at me with both your knives and we'll see how this goes. No, that's not how this game is played, unfortunately. And so, like I said, if you've ever dealt with somebody that's having a real crisis, you know that crisis, and if that crisis meets the police, it may not go well. And you can't really blame the police for that. What I blame is people not getting others the help that they clearly need. We're going to read more about that. During that earlier encounter, a fellow officer quickly talked the distraught man into surrendering peacefully, and he was taken to a hospital for evaluation. So that's what happened that time. Maybe this guy got even more agitated this next time around. Maybe he was, chemistry in his body was wildly different. Maybe he had, flashbacks from that. Who knows? You don't know, because the person is not in their right mind to be able to describe what's going on and what they're thinking and what they're feeling. They're just rushing at a police officer. And guess what? Unfortunately, that's, there's no de-escalating that, right? I mean, police officer's not going to run, because then he kind of lets the situation just go to anybody in the area. All right, yeah, I'm going to be back in a half-mile lap, and I'll see how you're doing then. No, you just got to handle it right on the spot. And these cops have to make just judgment decisions, and I'm like, oh, that would be, super difficult to do. In contrast, in December 2019, officers actively escalated the encounter and manner of approach, immediate aiming of weapons and shouted voice commands, and by failing to attempt use of less than lethal force prior to exerting lethal force. That's what the attorney said. Okay, that's what the lawsuit is based on. Alrighty. Yeah, maybe. But they were also dealing with what appeared to be somebody who, was going to commit a violent act with more than one knife. So there's that. City Attorney Robert Taylor on Thursday declined to comment on the pending suit. What else do we have? Raphael testified before the grand jury that he had recognized Henriksen, this is the police officer talking about Henriksen, when he arrived on scene and saw him walking with two knives in his hands, but described him as more threatening and combative. So maybe he was more upset. I don't know. This is all conjecture at this point. A bunch of this, probably already came out in the original grand jury, but it's going to come out further in this other lawsuit. He said he took out his rifle and pointed it at Henriksen and allowed another officer to try and communicate with them. Another officer still on probation, Sean Schroeder, ordered Henriksen to drop his knives, according to the grand jury transcript. Raphael said he slightly lowered his gun to talk to Henriksen and reminded him that they had met the month before. But he said he fired when Henriksen advanced towards them. It's not going to go well. You got a crazy person in a potentially violent situation. It's not going to go well. And to expect the police to de-escalate, I don't know. Okay. But you can only do so much. There's only, you got a super limited window, and it sounds like they tried to do that. And then, the guy rushed them and game over, unfortunately. Super unfortunate. 51. Another officer, Daniel Leonard, had grabbed a less lethal 40-millimeter foam-tip launcher from his car and fired it at Henriksen at the same time Raphael shot him with his rifle. So they both made a judgment call at the same time. That is, unfortunately, what happens in these situations. You got to go with what your instincts say, and you live with it. And, here we are. Shortly after the grand jury ruling in 2019, Henriksen's father, Rick Henriksen, told the Oregonian that he wasn't surprised by the jury's finding, but that he firmly believed the officer's force was excessive and unwarranted. All right, but what would the alternative be? What would that look like? Because that's oftentimes what we're talking about, right? We're talking about these situations, and when you really dig down, it comes down to a guy with 2 knives rushing a cop. So how do you go about de-escalating that? Obviously you can use de-escalation techniques, but what if you can't? And I think that's what we're dealing with here. And so, bottom line is this guy shouldn't have been out on the streets. He shouldn't have been out there, roaming around. He said his son never wanted to hurt anybody, and he was probably so confused he didn't really know what he was doing. That is probably absolutely true. Rick Henriksen reached Thursday morning, declined to comment about the suit. The deadly shooting marked the 3rd time in 4 months that police had encountered Henriksen. This is an ongoing thing, right? Cops knew it. Henriksen probably had, animosity towards the police. I don't know, but that is oftentimes the case because, they feel like they're getting hassled by somebody when they're just out doing stuff they shouldn't be doing because they're basically, not in their right mind. In August and November 2019, police were able to safely resolve incidents without force and had him taken by ambulance to a hospital for mental health treatment. So the suit also alleges that the city failed to properly train or discipline officers whose force violates policy. That's where I'm kind of like, yeah, really? I mean, look at the scenario here. The guy rushed a couple of cops with knives. I mean, what? Yeah. Henriksen had lived in a group home in Portland for many years, but after he left home, he felt he couldn't find an alternative placement that was acceptable to him, his father said. So he's known to have, severe enough mental issues that he needs to be in a group home. That's a safe place for him. At times, his son pleaded to go to the state hospital, but he wasn't deemed enough of a threat to warrant placement there, his father said. For many years, Rick Henriksen said that he was unable to obtain direct information about his son's mental health care because Henriksen was an adult. So he wasn't enough of a threat. He wasn't bad enough to be put in the state hospital and kept there. And yet he needed to be in a group home for years and years, but then couldn't figure out a solution after that. And that is so many times kind of what we're talking about with the people that we find living in homeless encampments. It's not a huge percentage that are just absolutely crazy, and that's the only reason. Oftentimes it has to do with drugs as well. But, mental issues play into this and play into the homeless a great deal. I mean, a great deal. And in a case like this where somebody loses their life, you're kind of like, okay, so he fell between the cracks. He fell between the cracks as far as being able to get the support and the living situation that he really needed. And that's where it's not the police's fault. It's not his dad's fault. It's not his own fault. It's just one of those situations where, as a society, where we sit right now, we don't have solutions for all of these situations that are working out well. We basically dumped people out of the mental institutions. And now that's why we're running into these situations where the police are having to make judgment calls with homeless people all the time. I mean, couldn't tell you how many stories you read about this. A lot. I mean, it's ongoing. And here's a case where who was at fault? Was anybody specifically at fault? It's so hard to say. The guy fell in between the cracks. That's kind of the way I see it. And what's really sad is when somebody falls in between the cracks of what otherwise society should have helped them with, which is a mental disorder. We just no longer, we don't go to the hard line edge of, well, you need to be institutionalized. When in fact, in this case, that individual, there's a high likelihood he might still be alive. His dad might be able to visit him in the institution, in the group home, in the whatever, if he'd been able to get the help that he needs. So super tragic story, and I don't have a happy ending for it. But is he going to win in the civil suit? I don't know. I'm not an attorney, and I don't want to really speculate on that. But of the cases that I've kind of looked through and seen, most of these don't pan out. But you got to give them a good shot. I mean, like the mother of the kid at CHOP, the first young man to lose his life. You know, there is probably some liability on the city's part where this young man got shot at CHOP and there were no police around, and getting police to clean out the scene and enough to get an ambulance in there. I mean, the city's got some liability on something like that, in my opinion, in a case like that. But in this situation, where the guy, you know, runs at somebody with more than one knife in his hand and had been waving the knife around and appeared to be menacing. Maybe he wasn't menacing. Maybe he was. You know what I mean? When people wig out, you just assume, okay, this person's wigged out. And so they are not going to be, you know, sitting down and picking flowers anytime soon. They're usually so chemically imbalanced that they can't think straight. And until they kind of get those levels of chemicals in their body to come down and they can, you know, be somewhat normal, it's not a good thing. It's not a good thing. So if you've ever been around somebody that has mental issues and, you know, if they're mobile, if they're able to get around, they're not handicapped in any way, that's your worst fear, is that, if this goes sideways and they start talking to the cops, it's not going to go well. Because the cops have their training. They are trained to handle situations in a certain manner. And if public safety comes up and they feel that that is threatened, there's protocol that they follow. And, you know, this lawsuit is saying, you know, maybe this could have been handled differently. Well, maybe it could, and maybe the attorneys will work that out. But oftentimes when I read these cases, it's like, yeah, there was no guilt found and there's basically no case found here. You want to have a different result because somebody lost their life. You want to be able to pin blame on somebody. But I don't think in this case you can. I don't, you know, you might, yeah, that's just kind of where I sit. And I've been in situations where you're dealing with somebody who's either, you know, on drugs or just boozed out of their mind or a combination, or is having some mental issues, whether it's schizophrenia or bipolar. You can't ration with them. So you got a guy coming at you with two knives and he's not going to be able to be rationally talked down off of his ledge, figuratively. It's not going to end well. And that's what I think you need to realize is that, okay, there are a lot of situations where this happens and we all want to pin the blame. You know, everybody wants to, in today's day and age, they want to pin the blame on the cops because that seems to be like the most likely thing to do. Be reasonable. If you had somebody coming at you with two knives and you'd encountered them before, and this time he looks like he means, you know, greater business. Unfortunately, it didn't end up well for Henriksen. And yeah, the situation where somebody is an adult by age, chronological age versus their mental, you know, their developed mental capacity. That's another thing. That's another really tough one because you see these people walking around and you talking to them and you're like, oh, that guy is not dealing with a full deck of cards, like literally. And so they are not able to make decisions at times. So yeah, unfortunately, police officers are put in a situation where this stuff happens, and I can't blame them. They're doing their job. They're trying to handle public safety for us. And in Oregon, that is a tricky thing to do at best. Because, you know, so much has happened with the police department down there. And, you know, to have this kind of thing go on. It's part of the job, yes. However, you know, nobody wants to end somebody else's life because then you got to deal with that. You got to think about that. You got to, yeah, it's so hard. So difficult. So that's it for me on this one. You know, place the blame where you want to. But in this one, I don't think anybody is to blame except the way that our cities and our governments are handling mental institutions and the dumping out of people from mental institutions. And I think, you know, governments have responsibility to handle things like we used to in certain aspects, but now we deem people being in mental institutions that's not the way to go, but is letting somebody roam around on the streets when they need mental help and having them have their lives ended because of something that they may not have even been aware of what was going on. You know, is that the solution? Either that's not a solution. That's, it's a byproduct of a bad solution, which is just don't provide people the care that they need. So yeah, tricky situation all the way around, right? Yeah, I mean, just brutal. But here we are. And yeah, no happy ending here. Sorry about that. But these are the things that we need to talk about, because what are we going to do moving forward? That's the real question, right? So identifying it, I think, is the first thing. And then moving forward, got to figure that one out. I am certainly no psychologist. Some people would say I need psychological help. Don't we all? So there's that. All right. Thanks so much for being here. Thanks so much for tuning in to News for Reasonable People. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Love to have you subscribe if you so see fit. Thanks again. We'll catch up soon. Talk then. Bye for now.